Hello, welcome to week 4 of Portfolio Management for Personal Financial Planners. This week, you're going to take the work you've done in the last 3 weeks and put it all together to prepare a recommended asset allocation for the Smith family. So you'll use the IPS elements that you did in week 1, and you'll use your capital market expectations and efficient frontier that you generated in the work of the last 2 weeks on the different asset class returns and variability. You do not have to be constrained by the efficient frontier. What we want you to do is come up with a reasonable asset allocation that meets their expectations in terms of returns, at the same time matches their risk tolerance, their ability, and willingness to take risk. The first step in Part A is to figure out how much of the $1.5 million in their overall portfolio needs to be set aside as a cash reserve. So look at what their immediate cash needs are and determine how much of that should be set aside. And then that remaining balance in step 2 of Part A is going to be allocated between the different asset classes that you choose to include. You do not have to include all the asset classes that are listed there. It doesn't have to be a point on the efficient frontier. You're going to take everything into consideration and use your best judgment to come up with the asset allocation that you think is most appropriate for the Smiths. You'll bring in your expected return for each asset class, your expected standard deviation for each asset class, and then you will allocate in both dollar and percentage terms the remainder of their $1.5 million portfolio that you did not set aside as a cash reserve. Now, when you calculate for the overall portfolio, you're going to want to calculate the expected return from the portfolio and the expected standard deviation from the portfolio. The expected return for a portfolio is relatively easy. You basically weight the returns of the individual asset classes by the percentage that they represent out of 100 for the overall portfolio. Standard deviation is much more complicated. You need to look at the standard deviation of each. You have to look at the correlation between the asset classes. You can't do that by hand. You can, but it would take a very long time, and it's a very complicated formula if you're using as many asset classes as you might for this particular project. So what I want you to do is to use Portfolio Visualizer again. You'll basically rerun the efficient frontier, but this time you'll put in the percentage allocations for each asset class in addition to your expected annualized return and your expected standard deviation. Those should be the same that you came up with in week 3 generally. However, if based on the feedback for week 3, you decided to adjust some of your assumptions, that's fine too. You can take a fresh look at your expected return and your expected standard deviation for this week's project. I won't hold you to what you did in the week 3 project, particularly if you're responding to feedback. So you'll enter the expected return, the expected standard deviation, and the percentage allocated to each asset class. And then Portfolio Visualizer will calculate for you not just the efficient frontier once again, but they will also calculate for you the expected return and the expected standard deviation of the overall portfolio. In Part B, it's essay, although it's basically essay based upon this, particularly on the Smiths. The first part in Part B is to justify your recommended asset allocation. Why did you choose the allocation that you did, and why do you think it's appropriate for the Smiths? In Part 2 of Part B, you're going to compare your recommended asset allocation to the efficient frontier. And so it's not likely to land on the efficient frontier. So basically go up to the nearest point on the efficient frontier and compare the expected return and the expected standard deviation of your recommended asset allocation to the nearest point on the efficient frontier. How does it look for return relative to risk compared to the efficient frontier? Is it way off, or is it pretty close? In Section 3 of Part B, you're then going to go through and say, okay, just in general, for each of the asset classes that you've chosen to include in their asset allocation, which ones would you put in taxable accounts versus tax-deferred accounts? right now you can assume that you have a blank slate. Next week we're going to look at how you're going to invest each of those asset classes. You don't have to feel constrained by what the Smiths are currently holding. You're coming up with your recommended asset allocation, assuming you have a blank slate, based upon their IPS and the work that you've done on returns. And then you're going to say, okay, just in general, this particular asset class I would put in the taxable account or the tax-deferred account, and why. In Part 4 of Part B, you're going to come up with an estimate of any additional cost. So, for example, if you're using indices for the individual asset classes when you calculated returns, those include no cost whatsoever. So if you're actually going to implement this, you would be using ETFs or mutual funds. You're also most likely going to be charging a management fee to the client. So we want you to do an estimate of what you think the overall transaction cost will do. Now, the DQ, the discussion question for this week, deals with transaction cost, so that'll give you a little bit of help there. If you have used ETFs for your individual asset class returns that you've already calculated, then there are some transaction costs already included. So this would be if there's any additional transaction cost that you think would be borne by the Smiths, calculate that in step 4, just as a percent relative to the overall portfolio. And then the last step, step 5 in Part B, is take the overall return of the recommended portfolio less any additional transaction cost you think would be incurred, and calculate what you think the net expected return is for the Smiths, and see if that meets their expectations. Make sure, once again, as you did earlier in the projects, to consider the impact of inflation. Good luck, and look forward to working with you this week. Have a good night.